Good morning, everyone. My name is Christiana Cacciapuoti. I run an organization called AdLedger. We are a nonprofit consortium, some of the biggest brands, agencies, and publishers in the world. And our mission is to build rules and standards for how blockchain and cryptography are being applied to media and advertising. Today we have a really fabulous panel of some of the biggest experts in marketing and media, so I'll let them introduce themselves.
My name is Schneck. I run Programmatic and data at Meredith, which means that I'm able to take all of the data we have and package it and make sure it's available in a safe, privacy-safe way for our clients and figure out how we actually use that to help them from a solution standpoint. And then I own the pipes to figure out how to get it there.
Fantastic.
Brad Tipper, a partner at Maximalist Ventures. We are an early stage investment and advisory platform focusing deeply on thematic investments around kind of social change, as well as expression of the theme around media and technology investments. So actively advising to a company called MadHive, and I think we spirited conversation today.
Great. So today's conversation is super timely. We have op-eds in the Times saying that Facebook should be broken up. There's actually an entire editorial series going on called the Privacy Project that's really going into explicit detail about all of the ways that our data is being collected and monetized and even exploited by these really big companies. And actually there was just a poll that says 79% of Americans are uncomfortable with all of this data happening in this very partisan and divided landscape. I think that's really remarkable to get 79% of people to be on anything. Yeah, aside from apple pie or something, right? So I would love to hear from you, Chip, just in your role as a publisher, why is data even important? What's the point of collecting all of this data?
Sure. When I think about data, it's kind of often spoken of as the fuel, which I think is an overused term, but we still haven't figured out what else to say about it.
Yeah.
But data is important to Meredith in a couple of ways. We, unlike most publishers, actually run a very large consumer business. We're the world's second largest licensor. And so in doing that, we leverage a lot of our data to figure out how to bring our branded products as well as other products to market, including subscriptions.
Yeah.
And so data becomes the core of everything we do. So the data used in the advertising business is actually a relatively new phenomenon for us in the last 5 years. And so data becomes the informant, or it becomes the guide by which we actually run our business.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting paradox. Advertising is actually one of the oldest industries in the world, but we have this really new and interesting angle of data-driven marketing for the very first time for the last 10 or 15 years. And I think it's really interesting because regulators are struggling to keep up with how do we understand how monopolies work given this data? How do we understand how to regulate? If I'm a government, I probably feel really uncomfortable if a foreign company has more data on my own citizens than I do. So Brad, I know that you work a lot with MadHive, of course, and they're very focused on the privacy piece. And in your journey there, we talk a lot about regulation. Can you give us like a high level overview?
I think it's interesting to see your Chip's perspective on data being so important in the last 5 years. And as we think of just the evolution of data and the regulation of it, it's really interesting, right? Like coming from the financial markets myself, the SEC and most of the rules and regulations that govern investing are from 1934, right? We're coming up on 80 years of kind of regulatory oversight. When we look at data and being introduced into a legacy kind of medium with advertising, right? With Mad Men up until public introduction of the internet, we have ads going on in '94, then the iPhone comes out, and now there's this proliferation. And the regulation hasn't caught up, right? Because we still think of advertising not necessarily being a data-driven commodity. We think of it as billboards, newspaper articles, television advertisement. We don't actually fully appreciate the level of precision and the level of manipulation of data that applying to this industry. And so regulation hasn't caught up. So it's interesting though now to see the paradox of consumers demanding kind of more regulation over there, but not necessarily appreciating what that means.
Yeah, and so we have GDPR. Obviously, we're here in Cameroon, Europe. GDPR, for those who don't know, is the General Data Protection Regulation, and it's a set of laws that the EU passed that went into effect last year in May. So we're coming up on over a year that they've been in effect, and it's designed to give consumers power over the data that's collected on them. California has just passed their own law that goes into effect in January, and I know federally now there's been quite a a bit of debate by Congress as to how should we implement this federally. So Chip, as a publisher, how are you guys dealing with privacy? Because I think for publishers, it's like this catch-22, right? Where like you want the data to be able to deliver consumers a really relevant experience, but you don't want to violate their privacy. So how do you balance that?
Sure. So going back to our history as a data-driven or what we would say data-led marketer, we've always had to take an extremely conservative approach to the data. I mean, we are the stewards long before regulation. Much to what you said, I teach my team every day that if you don't have a plan, one will be provided for you. And I think our industry has to think that way, which is if you don't provide your own regulation, regulation will be provided for you.
That's a great point.
And so, we as an individual company have had to figure out how to do it. And I think the way to think about it in the advertising world is we have to put the consumer first.
Yeah.
Every single time. And
Absolutely.
it used to be consumer experience, and then when privacy as an industry started becoming something, we had to start thinking, okay, so consumer first from a privacy perspective. And so we've run a very conservative privacy policy and whatnot. But the catch-22, if you always think about the consumer first, isn't really a catch-22 for us.
Okay.
The catch-22 comes from what you're calling, the middle layer.
Yeah.
Where we need the middle layer to help facilitate in an automated world.
Right.
But we have policies that actually sometimes differ from them.
Well,
Yeah.
it's actually interesting when you talk about putting the consumer first, because when you think about it, and now I'll put my lens as just a consumer of content, with GDPR, they've done a great job of getting ahead of the consent, right? If you're visiting a website on your phone or on your computer, right, you have to click the I agree button, and it's kind of in your face, and I always click no, which is kind of funny because unless I'm deeply familiar with that company or that organization, right, oftentimes they're very aware of what you're going to be doing with this information. I choose not to consent, but it's interesting. We talk about the GDPR in some aspects you could debate it's actually powered a lot of walled gardens because there's a certain familiarity, right, with a Facebook and Instagram and a social media platform, right? You've grown up with it, you're comfortable with it, so of course you're going to continue to agree and not necessarily investigate into the T's and C's as to what exactly you're doing with it. But if I'm going to, we're in Cannes and I'm in France and I'm visiting a site to understand what I want to do on Friday before I go back to New York, I'm going to just click ignore or exit out of the kind of the terms and agreements there because I understand that data isn't relevant to them.
Do you think then, and sorry to ask a question, but it's actually interesting, do you think then that brand helps the privacy or hurts privacy in the sense that consumer has that trust, but because they have that trust,
I think brand
they're not actually.
It's funny, I think brand becomes even more important in today's environment. And I think especially kind of funny when we think about the social goals house, I think brands themselves have to stand for much more than the service that they're providing for that reason.
Right.
And it's interesting how they can differentiate themselves because Facebook is arguably the one that's been caught up the most in data privacy, data manipulation, right? But they're also the ones that have benefited the most from regulation. So it's tough because, and I commiserate with regulators that are solving this challenge, and I give a lot of credit to what AdLedger is doing in terms of being very amenable and malleable to just setting forward the standards kind of for this next generation of advertising, but applying some of the principles that can help solve that because brand alone is a scary value prop for that reason.
Yeah.
Well, Scott Howe has this very funny expression, morality begins when the law ends, right? And so we have a certain stewardship, responsibility as all folks in the industry to manage to that.
Absolutely. So you guys brought up two really interesting points. You brought up the middle layer and all of the reasons that kind of makes a transaction much more complex. And you brought up the walled gardens. So I know Brad with MadHive, AdLedger and MadHive actually together commissioned some research that surveyed, I think, 100 marketers on a brand side, 100 agency marketers, and 100 publisher executives. And I think the number was 30 different tech vendors that was used in their ad stack to be able to deliver an advertisement. So there are obviously a ton of implications for privacy there. So I would love to hear your perspective as to why are they using this many vendors and what does that mean for the consumer and their privacy?
It's interesting why, right? Why are they using that many vendors? When you think about the challenges that creates, right? At the end of the day, if we take a giant step back and we think about advertising, we're trying to place an ad and target a consumer. It's a pretty direct relationship. And from the beginning, it was always a pretty direct relationship. So if we think about that 30 number, that means that there's 30 vendors involved in serving that one advertisement. Again, that's a pretty broad case here, but when we think about data privacy, data protection, data provenance, it's essentially a pinball machine, right? Where that piece of data at every step along the supply chain of actually reaching its end goal is being manipulated in some respects.
Yeah.
And I think that's a conservative view to think
Well,
of.
it's like playing telephone, right?
Yeah.
If I'm a consumer and there are 30 people between me and let's say you are the brand, all 30 of those have to faithfully reproduce what I consented to. And then if I revoke that consent, all 30 of them have to faithfully reproduce that revocation.
Yeah, very much
So huge implications for privacy there, of course. So it sounds a little bit like we're doomed at the moment. Do we think there's a solution? I, of course, think there's a solution. I'm very biased, but what do you guys think the solution is, if there is one?
And it's funny, and I very much humbly come at this from a very much an outsider's perspective. And I know that Chip, this is probably a dirty word, but we always talk about being end-to-end or full stack, and essentially kind of having a different view as to how do we solve for this kind of supply chain mess. And how do you create an open architecture? And I think AdLedger's done a great job in this respect of putting together new standards for kind of data validation. So if Meredith is already in the supply chain attesting that this is their inventory, that I, Brad, can't come in and say that I'm also Meredith, right? And there's a public recognition of that. If we think about the principles of blockchain, it's a distributed ledger. What does that mean? That means that that information is distributed among a number of parties. So if I shut off kind of my system or my computer, that information is still out there. And so Chip still maintains his identity and the kind of provenance behind Chip, even if one of the other systems fails, right? So there's always kind of an integrity behind the data, which I think is important.
Of course.
I would say doomed, no, I think our industry has been driven.
That's good.
Yeah. I'm gonna keep my job for today. And maybe this isn't something I should say, but as the guy who actually manages the group where the 30 come in, technology, we as an industry have embraced technology for what's new, not for what's needed. No one 9 years ago said, we need to automate the ad transaction. No one said, let's do this. Some technology company came up with the ability to do this and then started chopping it out.
Yeah.
So we are living the law of unintended consequences.
Very much,
Yeah.
And so when you think about the law of unintended consequences, we now sit at a time where it's the first time where it's not what's new, now it's what's needed.
Yeah.
And technology will hopefully help solve it. It won't be a panacea.
Yeah.
But AdLedger, in terms of how we think about the standards, that need for a standard is critical.
Yeah.
I refer back actually to something that happened yesterday. Tim Cook, right, announced, he's like, we created the chaos, we've got to take responsibility.
100%.
And in a way, I would look at it and say, well, Apple introduced the iPhone, and that's when information collection accelerated.
Location data.
Location data, all of this information. And so it's nice to see that. At the same time, though, we as an industry have commercially become reliant, to your point, on this. So we've put ourselves in a little bit of a catch-22, not the consumer advertiser, but just the
Industry
technology,
itself.
the industry itself. And we do have to find a way using standards and self-regulation before it's
too late. Yeah, I love the law of unintended consequences, and I love that you touched on blockchain, because I think this is one of the technologies that forces you to take a step back, because what I love to say is that you can't sprinkle a blockchain on top of anything and just expect it to be fixed. You really need to think it through in terms of architecture and infrastructure. We talk about blockchains the way that, like, I like to compare them to JavaScript or transistors. It's something that you use at the baseline infrastructure. It's not something you can just slap on top and call it a day. So of course that's what we're working on at AdLedger. But you mentioned cryptography as well. So we'd love to have you explain a little bit. What is the difference between blockchain and cryptography?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to kind of evangelize the differences. And a lot of my job is actually breaking that down into layman's terms, right? Like there's always a fear when something's new. And I think the biggest challenge right now blockchain cryptography really has is a PR battle more than anything else. It's the same reluctance that I saw when the cloud.
Is it the same thing as Bitcoin?
Yeah, no, it's like, think about it, 5 years ago when cloud computing came out, right? There was a fear. I remember I was still backing everything into a hard drive because I was afraid to put myself in the cloud, because what did that mean? It was an undefined term for us. And so when we think about cryptography, it's funny because cryptography is actually used every day that we don't necessarily appreciate. So I'm going to go online and purchase something and I see that verified by Visa. That is a cryptographic technique, right? That they're able to extract enough information about me to process that transaction, but I can still maintain all the kind of validity of my information, right? So the cryptography is just mathematics. When we think about blockchain, it's purest form. It's just the distribution of information among multiple sources, so that there's always kind of a redundancy layer there, which provides a tremendous amount of value, irrespective of industry. Especially as we kind of chain everything under the global goals house. As to what we're really thinking about, just how those principles can apply. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to say cryptography is ways to make information usable but not visible.
Yes.
And I'm sure, Chip, that you can see many use cases for that type of principle in your role, but what do you think some of those could be, and how do you think they can relate to consumer privacy?
Sure. So I think it actually comes back to the whole idea of the focus on consumer, right? So if I think about the idea of publishers previously not really embracing tech and having tech provided for us, this is the first opportunity where in AdLedger, right, publishers are an important piece, right?
Yeah,
we're part of the drawing of the standards, and we're comfortable with tech.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that if I would look at one great thing about RTV, it's gotten publishers, comfortable with tech,
right,
to the extent that we can actually now try to understand it, but actually be a part of the development of it. And for us, it's it's consumer first. So it's not just in the ad transaction as a big e-commerce driven publisher. It's in any transaction.
Yeah.
Right. Whether we're providing the service, someone else is providing the service, or we're delivering service.
Right. And it's almost, you can have your cake and eat it too as a consumer, right? If I can make my information available for use but not reveal it, truly, that's the Holy Grail, right? I can have a relevant experience that I'm not going to get, men's shoes ads. I'll get, ads for purses or something, but I won't have to reveal my identity to have that happen. I could still sleep at night.
It expands the idea of what registration means as well, right? In terms of authentication, right? To your point, the user's information is the user's, but from an authentication standpoint, I think it starts to give us a little bit more understanding or a little bit more ability to think of authentication a little bit more broadly.
And I guess to kind of not fully appreciate the audience, but in the vein of the global goals, and we think about just the impacts, that I think that that middle layer can be good stewards just beyond just their own companies, right? And we think about the implication this can have on kind of societal impacts, right? When we think about data validation, data privacy, data provenance, right?
Yeah.
You apply this to elections, right? You apply this to the distribution of information.
I was going to get my next question. Why is privacy so important, specifically in advertising? Because I think a lot of people say, well, just advertising, it doesn't matter. And I think in 2016, we saw it matters. It really matters, the way that we're being not manipulated, but influenced to think and feel and even vote. So why do you think that we have a responsibility as an industry to protect consumers' privacy?
Yeah, but I mean, when you think about it, and not to kind of blow the example too far, but if we think about the last election cycle in the US, just the fact that we could target people essentially on their fears almost, right? We knew so intimately about kind of the end person that we can kind of prey on that, we can exacerbate that without kind of our conscious understanding. And even just the whole concept, and I used to love, when we talk about the academic debate about the ozone layer, right? It wasn't a partisan issue. The partisan issue was how we apply funding to it, but we never debated that
there was a problem.
Right. Now we're debating every fact, right? Because there isn't that data provenance protection. So we have to challenge every fact before we can even develop a solution. And I think that's, we have a responsibility because a lot of this is funded by advertising dollars.
The whole internet was. I think that's something that people don't really realize. That the internet, the reason we got adoption as rapidly as we did is because it was this exchange, right? You're trading your attention for this content. And so it's interesting. Sorry, I missed your response.
I was gonna say, I think part of the thing from a publisher perspective is, I think maybe not related to privacy, but it actually has a really important piece, which is publishers have been trying to move beyond advertising, right? It's not just having a consumer, from a traditional publisher or otherwise a subscription business, but it's also how do you deal with performance content and commerce and whatnot? Because in a lot of those areas, you're actually not using the middle layer to help deliver. For us, privacy or how you deal with consumer privacy, it's both the concern of the how do you treat the consumer when you're messaging them or influencing them, and especially in areas of health or other areas where you you've got to draw the line, but it's also the number of partners involved with actually touching. The whole idea of the 30 partners, I want to be responsible for all 30, but I can't be responsible for
Well,
for all
sometimes
30.
you don't know.
And because we don't
You could work
know,
with one,
yeah.
and they could work in turn with 15 or 20, and you could have no idea.
And so I think that also becomes how do we hold ourselves responsible? And that's where the idea of the consortium will really benefit. And to your point, even though facts are debated, I think everyone in the advertising industry is united, wrongly or rightly, behind the idea of I don't want to be regulated, and so I've got to figure it out myself. And that's not a bad fear, right? We want to put the consumer first, and we're going to figure out a way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
The publisher side, if you guys can all have global standards you're all operating from is really important, because publishers are in a very tricky position because their businesses are generated off the demand of the consumer, right? And the demand of clicks in some instances, right? And so there has to be content that supports that. And oftentimes it's that paradoxical situation where you want the eyeballs, but you have to be a good steward also.
Yes.
Yeah.
To the brand of the consumer.
Yeah. Well, and I think as an industry, it's, well, what kind of world do we even as consumers want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where our health data is available? If they know I have a weakness for Doritos and I'm on a diet, should Doritos know, or cakes, or whatever unhealthy food, know that I have this weakness? Or going into a more dark place, should insurance companies have access to that data? Like, we can go down a really scary path when we have all of this data that's just out there, and with very minimal data science, you're able to stitch it together. So that's something I'm super passionate about preventing in terms of my role at AdLedger. But would love to hear, to kind of close us out, where you guys think AdLedger could make the biggest impact? Where do you hope that we as a group will be in the next 2, 3, 4 years?
I think at the purest form, adoption and participation. I think bringing the conversation from philosophical and academic to actual practical use cases. And so I've been tremendously encouraged to see AdLedger come out kind of with its first test with cryptography, I think about a month ago, just actually giving the industry the tools in which they can apply some of these principles of cryptography and blockchain to actually solve some of the challenges we spent a lot of this conversation kind of articulating.
I would add just one thing. I think adoption is obviously really important, but adoption can't happen without education.
Absolutely.
Right? And the fact of, even though from a publisher side, you have a lot of publishers who become more comfortable with technology, there's that education curve to your point of the cloud. Like, I'm not going to put it out there until all of a sudden you realize, oh, well, that is.
Yeah.
And so I think that is, I think that's a critical responsibility, but it's also one of the things that AdLedger has the best opportunity for.
Absolutely, 100%. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. It was great chatting with you.